This is Talking Drupal, a chat about web design and development by a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 158, Local Development with Docker. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
We are
Top
top
of the afternoon.
top of the afternoon. Not quite. We're
Evening,
recording in
I
the
guess.
evening. If you're watching us on YouTube, you'll see John has that mood lighting that you can tell it's nighttime.
I'm illuminated by laptop glow.
Yeah.
It's like ghost stories around a campfire.
Yeah, exactly. So we can also see that Nick has a new camera, a
Yeah.
much clearer picture. Is that true? Or does it look the
Yeah,
same
I
to you, John?
It's much wider of an angle. You can see all the fun stuff on Nick's bookshelf there.
Right.
It's a wide angle, especially for podcasts, which I think every webcam company has just put on every webcam they sell now. But I'm pretty happy with it.
Mine's a wide angle, but because I'm a wide guy, it just looks normal.
So I'm Stephen Cross, and in this week of Talking Drupal, episode 158, we're going to be talking about local development with Docker. Before we do that, we have a few news items that we just wanted to bring up that we put in the show notes. First is related to Drupal Con because the deadline for submitting your sessions has come and gone, right?
It has. It has come. It has actually come twice and gone twice.
Exactly. I thought that actually the second deadline was next week.
I don't think so.
That wasn't. It wasn't beginning of February. Guess I was wrong.
Well, tomorrow is the beginning of February.
That's true.
So it's my clever remark of the day.
So anyway, they did extend the sessions submission for DrupalCon. John, you had some thoughts about that?
I think they got a lot of sessions. They got 900 and some odd sessions when it was all said and done. So I submitted a session. A couple of my coworkers submitted sessions. So hopefully one of those 900 and 14 or whatever it was. Hopefully the three that we submitted, one of them gets chosen. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Good luck. I did not submit one. Doesn't mean I won't be going, but I did not submit one. I don't think you did either, Nick. Did you?
Nope, not this year.
No. So we also have coming out on March 7th, which is really right around the corner here, is Drupal 8.5. Is there anything in there that's jumping out at you guys as important?
I'm looking forward to it because isn't this the first release where experimental modules might get kicked back out? I'm not sure if any are, but I think this is the first release where that could happen. So I'm curious to see if that will.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know about that.
Might have been 8 point. I think 8.4 might have been, and then they extended for the couple of experimental we had. So I'm curious to see how that policy is going to work out.
I think it's probably a good policy to keep the project moving.
Yeah, I like the release schedule. I think it's been pretty consistent. I think it's been a good thing for Drupal, and I think the policy that we're talking about, which is experimental modules, I think get 2 minor releases, gives them plenty of time, to become stable. I think gives them plenty of time to try out, and I think it gives people a good way to experiment with modules. So curious to see how it works out in the end.
So if we move on to our show topic is lately we've all been kind of jumping into these different local development environments. We're going to highlight one today, which is Docker, which Nick has more experience than John and I. So I think going up the chain, it's probably Nick, myself, and then John sort of huddled close together behind him in terms of our experience with it. I have over the past month been using Docker and recently DocSol, which I've learned is just a wrapper really around Docker. So kind of have a little bit of experience with that, and also Lando I've been using. So I mean, all of these local development environments are just coming at us like crazy. The days of MAMP are over, or very limited for WAMP and MAMP users. It makes a lot of sense.
WAMP. that brings back nightmares of when I was still using Windows. Oh my God. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of Docker, huge proponent. I think it's great for local development environments, great for customizations. In fact, I was just talking to a client of mine today, where I'm going to have to do some PHP work and work on upgrading something that's in an older stack, and Docker is perfect. So I don't have to downgrade or install a different version of PHP, a different version of MySQL on my machine. I can just set up the Docker containers and put the code there, and I'm good to go. So big fan of Docker.
You know, recently for myself, are you guys familiar with? I don't know how you sell this Pico or Pico. Is anyone familiar with that CMS? Anyone ever heard of it? I've been playing with it for about 6 months
No,
off and on, and it's
really.
basically a flat file CMS based in PHP. You basically create your content in Markdown files, and then this PHP goes through and John's laughing his head off there, right? It's really nice for a small website that basically you can deal with like a Git repository. The whole site is in there, so it runs super fast because there's no
Huh.
database. It takes very little resources. You can run it on anything, right? It's just something I've been playing with in my spare time. But the interesting thing and how it relates to this is when I got a new desktop here a month so ago that I'm running Linux on, it was super easy for me to say just create an environment that was just a PHP and Apache environment with something like Docker, right? So I have that environment that's running that's just got PHP, got an operating system, and has Apache, and that environment is up and running.
So why don't we explain what Docker is? So we've said how good it is, but what is Docker? And so for me, I think Docker. I think the easiest way to understand it, Docker is using the container system to allow you to isolate different environments. So it's similar to Vagrant. If you're familiar with Vagrant, it's similar in that it allows you to isolate a specific uh, ecosystem from the main computer. It's a little bit different from Vagrant. One of the biggest differences is Vagrant is a virtual machine. It requires an operating system. Typically, it's some version of Linux, but you can also install Windows, or I believe you can even install. I believe you can even install Mac on there if you need to. But it requires a full functioning operating system, and then you install your requirements on there as well. So you basically, with Vagrant, you start with a base install of Ubuntu, and then you'd install Apache, you'd install PHP, you'd install a couple of the things. The way Docker works and containers work is it basically uses the kernel of the machine that you're on, and then isolates the processes from everything else in your computer. So instead of like installing Ubuntu and then something else, you're just taking the requirements that you need for PHP or the requirements that you need for Apache, and putting them in place. So it gives you a much lighter weight system. One of the advantages we'll talk about in a little bit is it's much faster, and it also makes it a little bit more portable.
Nick, are the containers running like an OS? Like, I mean, is it synonymous to a virtual machine, or is a container simply just loading the resources that you need, like you said, PHP, MySQL, that sort of thing, and then using the host machine's resources to kind of make sure they have enough power to do what they need to do?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think you can actually run full OSs if you need to, but it kind of defeats the purpose of using Docker if you're doing that. But it's more of the latter that you're saying. I'm not super well versed on the under the hood mechanics of Docker, but from what I understand, it's using the resources of your machine in a way that's isolated from the actual machine. So it uses the kernel of, in my case, in Steven's case, uses the kernel of Linux in order to run, and then it has the dependencies on top of that. Containers the reason why they're called containers is something that was developed in the Linux world, which was why the release schedule on Mac took a little while, because they had to kind of, I think, port that in,
Well,
and get better support.
it's my understanding that Docker requires Linux to run. So on like on our desktops, Linux is already there. On a Mac, it's actually firing off a Linux environment that it runs Docker in.
Don't quote me on this, but I think the latest versions, because it's based on Unix, I think the latest versions have increased support for containers natively, which is why I think the more recent versions of Docker have worked better. But by default, the Docker installation on Mac was using a virtual machine. And I believe on Windows, the only way to do it is to have a virtual machine that you're running Linux on. Which brings us to to the next point. I mean, if you're using Linux, Docker is way faster. Although, like I said, the latest version for Mac has had a huge performance increase. So it's on par for Linux. So
Crystal clear, John.
Clearer. Yeah, clearer. I mean, yeah.
It's been one of the things that I've been using Vagrant for quite a while, and as I started to just tinker around with Docker, it's been very muddy in my head. And I think I've asked Nick 3 or 4 times to explain it to me, is what is the core difference between these? And it's really the under the hood of how these things are running. I mean, at the end of the day, the purpose of them from the point of our discussion is virtually the same, right? So the objective is to get an isolated environment that you can configure to run, in our case, a Drupal application in.
Yeah, and that's one of the key advantages. It doesn't matter if I'm using Ubuntu and you're using a Mac, and I'm using Ubuntu 14 and you're using Ubuntu 18. Like, the image itself, the container itself will run exactly the same on your machine as my machine.
So let me ask this. So, like, the same is true of Vagrant, right? Yeah, I can basically set up a replica of my production server in a Vagrant environment, and Vagrant up that environment, and I basically have the production server running on my computer. Is that same thing possible with Docker? And is the main claim to fame here that it is faster than trying to do it with Vagrant?
Well, the answer is yes, with some caveats. I think one of the big differences is, like we said, with Vagrant, you need the whole OS. So each machine that you spin up for Vagrant takes up a fairly significant amount of processing power and RAM on your system. So especially in systems where you have multiple machines interacting with each other, that very quickly becomes expensive. Like, if you have a production environment that has 2 Varnish servers, 2 database servers, and 2 web heads, then that's 6 Vagrant machines you have to have running, and that that can be a significant amount of overhead. You have to have a pretty powerful machine to run that. Docker, you can run just the Varnish binaries, just the Apache pieces or Nginx pieces that you need, and you can run just the database. And so it's a much smaller footprint.
Right, but so it's not going to give you the ability to test the full system. So, really obscure example, if you had an issue with, I don't know, some sort of setting in CentOS, right, and it was causing you an issue. I mean, could you set Docker up to have CentOS to be able to test that?
Yeah, so you can do that. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do that I'm seeing, not so much in the Drupal world, but I am seeing more and more in the web world, is you can isolate your production machines with Docker as well. So instead of having a production machine and trying to replicate that, you use the actual production Docker image to run your website. So it doesn't matter if CentOS updates, because your actual application is running in Docker itself. So it's isolated. One of the issues right now is, like you said, sometimes you update something and it might mess up something in the production machine. But if your production is running Docker and your application is running in a container, as long as the machine can run Docker, it's not going to affect your application. In fact, you could move your application from CentOS to Ubuntu and not have to worry about anything, because you just have to make sure Docker is installed.
So are you suggesting that people use Docker as a production environment
Absolutely.
for their website?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
instead of running the website directly on Linux on the server, running it in Docker on the server?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. People are absolutely doing it. Now, when you say suggesting, I'm not saying people should go out and Dockerize their Drupal site necessarily. But
I just wonder, is there
but
really
yes, people are. Yeah,
that
absolutely.
much of a benefit to that?
Absolutely. Yes. And so why don't we talk about some of those benefits? Some of the benefits are, like I said, it's a smaller footprint and it's much faster spin up speed. So you can do things like, especially in situations where scaling is very important, you can, through more advanced techniques than we'll talk about today, you can basically determine things like an Apache instance can handle 10 concurrent connections with 50 megabytes of RAM. And so you have a controller that basically looks at it and says, oh, we have 50 connections right now. So we have, we might have 6 containers running, 5 to handle the current connections and 1 to handle more. And then all of a sudden it sees, 20 incoming. It can spin up 2 more images to handle that incoming load, and spinning up a new Docker container can, depending on how you configure it, can take less than 50 milliseconds. So it can handle all the incoming load. So the idea is that you can utilize your infrastructure more efficiently by using Docker, rather than having one machine run Apache and maybe sit at 20% utilization all the time. You can set it up so that you have a couple machines that run different pieces, and you get closer to full utilization without seeing a decrease in performance, because the individual containers are not overloaded.
And do you know of a hosting provider or a service provider that's actually doing this?
All of them? Pantheon's
Yeah.
using it quite a bit.
Yeah. Although I don't know if they use, I know that they use Lando for some, or what was it, Calabox for some things. And I know that they use containers, but I think they might use actual Linux containers and not Docker, although I'm sure they're
using Docker as well.
Oh, so they've moved to Docker?
Yeah, I've seen presentations from the guys
Okay.
at Pantheon.
Yeah.
They've done scaling and all kinds of stuff with Docker containers.
Okay. Yeah, because I knew they started with containers themselves, and I thought I had heard that they moved to Docker. But yeah, it's fairly mainstream, and it's a pretty cool space. It takes a fair amount of work, especially in the Drupal sphere. When you have things that need to be persistent, like databases, it takes a little bit more architecture. So like I said, I'm not advocating that you go out tomorrow and convert your site to Docker, because you need to do a fair amount of research. But yeah, it is.
And also the title of this show is Local Development with
Exactly.
Docker.
Exactly.
It is a fascinating topic, and it's becoming so much more important. And I'm curious, John, you've mentioned that you've just started using Vagrant. Is that like a company move to a Vagrant environment, or?
So yeah, I'm a late adopter on the Vagrant front.
Okay.
Our development team has been using Vagrant for a while.
I thought so.
And I've been kind of sticking with MAMP for just because my locals have all been set up, and haven't really had time to switch gears. But we're actually rolling out a new project framework, and in testing it, I've started using Vagrant more and switching some of my projects over to use Vagrant instead of my MAMP environment.
And have you found that to be painful?
No,
Just the learning curve, right? Just
not
learning
even.
on how it
I,
works and stuff.
I mean, not even that. Because I've been exposed to it. I kind of, I have a pretty good idea of how it works.
Right.
And I'll say some of our senior engineers have done a really great job of making things really easy
Right.
for our development team
Yeah.
in building provisioning scripts.
Like clone it and just type Vagrant up.
Yeah, so
Right.
our current project framework has all of that stuff in it. So when you get a project, you can Vagrant up and you're off and running.
So so after this show, you're gonna throw all that away and redo everything in Docker.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is, as I said, we're working on our a new project framework right now, and it is based on Vagrant, but maybe that's not 100% set in stone. I don't know.
You know, one of the reasons why I actually moved to Docker was I was using Vagrant for several projects for some clients, and I found that it wasn't as consistent either. In general, it was, but I found several situations where Vagrant up just didn't work. It would die halfway through, or things couldn't. And this was more complex sites, so they would have to communicate with different instances, and they just wouldn't. They wouldn't communicate with each other. I would have to
Those
set up special uh, sections in the host file so they could networking between Vagrant containers, Vagrant machines rather, is um, a fair amount more complex than it is in Docker.
Sure.
And I found that whenever you had to do that, it didn't work consistently, and that's one of the reasons why I started turning to Docker. Besides the speed.
One of the things I've noticed just recently using Drupal VM, I'm not sure if you guys over there, John, are using Drupal VM. Drupal VM supports Docker now, so you don't have to use Vagrant. You can use Docker instead with it. I haven't tried it yet, but it's something that I'll be doing pretty soon.
Yeah, I actually installed Docker last week, 2 weeks ago, something to that effect, and got a Drupal VM site up and running pretty quickly on a Docker container, and it was quick, it was easy, and Drupal VM is great. That's something that we've been looking at too for our new project framework. Is using Drupal VM, and yeah, I think Drupal VM works great, and you can get a site up pretty quick with it.
So I think we've convinced all of our listeners to use Docker, or at least look into it. So you sit down at your computer, you're ready to go. What's the first step? Because
Call
I
Nick.
think that
Yeah,
you can
exactly.
always call me. I think there's a few resources actually to plug myself a little bit more. I gave a talk at last year's NedCamp, and I think we'll have the link in the show notes. So if you want to hear a little bit more in depth of how I've used Docker in the past, you can take a look at that on YouTube. And there's also some getting started docs. The docs for Docker, the documentation is pretty solid. So you can take a look at those two links, and that's pretty helpful. But the first step is you have to install it. So Docker's a program, and you have to have it's harder to set up on a Windows machine. You either have to install it on your Mac, or you have to install it on your Linux machine. Pretty straightforward to install. I think on the Mac, there's a couple of different packages that you can use. I think there's a Docker for Mac, and there's another one. I think I use the Docker for Mac one, and it's been pretty solid. Although I think you might have to have the latest version of Mac OS. It doesn't support the latest one, and I get a warning every time I turn on my computer that I need to update.
It's working. It's certainly working on Sierra and
Yeah,
iSierra because I've used it in both of those environments.
Yep, it works pretty well. So
Nick,
take a look at that.
Nick, have you in installing Docker, have you used anything like Homebrew or Cask to install something like that?
I don't recall. I believe I just went to the Docker for Mac page and downloaded the app and installed it from the web. I don't think I actually used Homebrew in this case. But it was just like installing any other map. You double click on it and then drag it over, and it's working. So it's pretty straightforward to install. The next step is you need to kind of plan out what you're going to do with it. So there's a couple of different things you can do with Docker. One is which is, I would say, is a pitfall that many beginners kind of fall into, is you think, oh, this is great, it's isolated, I'm going to set up everything I need in this Docker container. So you set up a situation where you have Apache in there, you've got your MySQL in there, you've got your code base in there, you get Composer in there, you've got Drush in there, everything that you could think of you have in there. And while that's certainly possible, that kind of goes against the Docker way of doing things, the Docker ethos. You generally, I found it's generally more successful if you split the containers into more broad use cases. So for example, if I have a more complex stack, I would have one container that runs Nginx. I have one container that runs MariaDB. I'd have one container that runs Varnish. I'd have a container that maybe runs Solr for searching. And then I usually have a single container for containing, there's a little bit more explanation in the talk, but I'd have a single container for managing the code base. And then I'd have another container for managing a bunch of different utilities. So things like Composer, things like Drush. If you have any command line tools that you like to use, that I would install, my bash aliases there as well.
So Nick, this is your getting started approach. is to isolate everything into independent containers. That's how you would recommend someone start this? Or is this where they will end up being after using it for 6 months or a year? Just curious.
Yeah, maybe that's a little bit more complex.
Okay.
So where would you recommend that somebody, since you're a little bit closer to the getting started point?
Well, finish your point, because it's a good one, right? It's a good one. So why do you put things into independent containers? Why do you set it up that way? Finish that explanation.
Yeah,
and maybe how it works, and then maybe we'll backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, good point. So the reason why you want to do this is one reason is separation of concerns. That you don't have this behemoth of an application that has everything in it with a bunch of interdependencies. It makes debugging easier because that each individual piece you can update, one piece at a time. You don't, if you need to change the MySQL version, you can change the MySQL version in that container, and it's not going to affect anything else. And then you can do your testing. The other thing is it also makes it's much more maintainable because every time it's a little bit more advanced, but when you set up a new container each time, you can basically cache different steps. And if you have them all in one location, every time you change something, it has to remake everything after the change you made. So if you have one giant thing and you make a change near the top, then it's going to take a lot longer for it to rebuild because it has to rebuild. It'll have the cache in the beginning, and then it has to rebuild every step after that. Whereas if you have separate containers, even if you change something that was in quote unquote in the beginning of the stack, everything else after is cached because it's a separate container. And there's other benefits too, but those are the main ones that I've found.
So as when you're running Docker, you basically have something called the Docker file that defines what you're putting together. It's like a script, right? Is it YAML? Is it a YAML based or is it a JSON based file? I can't remember.
It's YAML.
YAML based. Okay. And when you're getting started, like when you first install Docker, there's this thing called, I think it's called Docker Store now. It used to be called Docker Hub. Am I right? But it's a place that people have defined these configurations ahead of time. So it would be like, I want to have a Docker install of Drupal 8. And it's someone who's pre-configured a setting of Docker for you that you can download and run.
That is a much better starting place than what I described.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start.
Okay, so I think that actually brings up a good point, and probably one of the reasons why I jumped ahead. So Docker, we've up until now we've been talking about containers, and when you set up a Docker file, you can run that as a container, and it will encapsulate whatever instructions you have in that Docker file, and it will set it up. You can then take a running container and you can create something called an image out of that. And the images are what is up on the Docker. I had no idea they changed the name. I almost
Right, it's Docker Store now, isn't
it? Yeah, it is Docker Store. I had no idea. That kind of scares me that they're going to start charging for individual items. But anyway, what you can do is you can take an image and you can tag it and you can put it up on the Docker Store and you can share that. And so let me put it this way. If I share a Docker file with somebody, that kind of gives them the tool they need to build a particular environment. So you might say, for example, here's a Docker file, put it in the code base of your website, run Docker build, and then you can run that container and it will have your site in it. And it will put, when it's building that, it will pull in the code base and it will spin up everything that you need to spin up, and you'll have a working site.
So it's like it's like a recipe, and the image is like all the ingredients of that recipe all put together.
Exactly. Well, the nice thing about the image is it's immutable. So if I have an image and you have an image, the exact same information is on that image. And the image is, when we were talking earlier about scaling, and we were talking about using in production, an image is what you would put in production, because it doesn't have to be built, it just has to be downloaded and run. And so when you're turning on an image that you have, it's even faster than building. So when I build one of my systems from scratch, it might take, well, assuming I have the base images, it might take 30 seconds, a minute. If you're just turning on an image, it takes less than half a second. I mean, it's super, super fast. And the image route is a good way to share specific points in time. So if I had a website and I was working on something and I wanted to save it as an example of like this, just thinking outside the box, you want to have a system where you can demonstrate something on a particular site and at a point in time, you can store that as an image and you can share that image. And then somebody could, no matter when it is, you can spin up that image and you'll be in that exact same point as you were when it was created. So yeah, they're pretty powerful. So yeah, I think that's probably a good way to get started. Pull down an image of Drupal 8. You can take a look at it. Once the image is running, you can actually connect to them. So you can SSH in. You can look around. It's a good way to experiment. So if you're learning how to install Drush rather, or you're learning how to run Composer, it's a good way. You can download that image. You can log in, and you can do, if you wanted, for example, to see, hey, what happens if I delete this file? You can have that image, you can go in, you can SSH in, delete that file and see what happens. And then you could just restart the image and everything back where it was. Essentially. Once you've got your hands around that, once you've understood kind of how that's working, most images, if not all images on the Docker store, have the associated Docker file. And you can usually take a look at that Docker file and you can start to understand, okay, this Docker file built this particular image, and you can see, start to see what the relationship is between the two. When you're developing, do you use images mostly, or do you use a Docker file and build from scratch, Stephen?
So I haven't done, other than experimenting, I don't use Docker for any production stuff or any development. I'm using all Vagrant right now. So my Docker work is experimental, and just kind of learning how it works. We're actually in the process of rebuilding the New England Drupal Camp website, and I'm using Doxel in that environment to spin that up, which is really Docker, I believe. I think that's what it is. I think Doxel is really just a wrapper around Docker, because when I fire up Doxel, I can run all the Docker commands and see the containers and see the images and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think Doxel is, yeah, I think it's a wrapper.
Yeah, it's like a
around
preset,
Docker.
a pre-built of scripts that they automatically do some stuff for you, so you can do less Docker commands, and it's integrated into the environment you're working with. So I think it's specific. They've like got scripts in there that are specific for Drupal. Anyway,
Wonder.
so the other thing I want to add to the getting started. So the way I kind of learned a little bit more about Docker is I bought a book. If you look for the Docker book, is the title, the Docker book. There's an
Hmm.
excellent book out there that takes you from like the command line, installing it, and then starting containers and starting with an empty Docker file and building it up on your own, so you understand how that whole thing works, creating images from it. I highly recommend, if you're the kind of person that likes to go page by page and just it takes you through examples of coding right through. It's a great way to get more familiar with it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point to make as well. This is a command line tool. I'm not aware of any GUI. I mean, it's very much for developers. It's very much for somebody who's familiar with the command line. But it's extremely powerful. I think once you get into the enterprise, I think there's some websites that allow you to do some things kind of with the GUI. But if you really want to get the most out of Docker, you need to get familiar with the command line.
So I think someone with all these things, from my experience with learning a few of them now, if someone hands you something and you can get up and running quickly, it gets you moving. But when you start to, the minute you have issues, like you mentioned earlier, Nick, that you were doing something with Vagrant and you couldn't get the Vagrant up to work, there's errors. Once you start to, and all these tools have these problems. I mean, if you start it up and it runs, everything's great. The minute you start it up and you start to run into problems, that's
Yeah.
where the tools, you start to get frustrated and you start to go, oh boy, my MAMP was a lot easier to deal with stuff. It's when you start to run into these little issues. And I've had trouble getting Doxel running on the same machine that I have Lando, which these are both Docker based tools. One runs and one doesn't run. And I've been struggling for 3 days trying to figure out what the difference is between them.
You should just run them inside a Docker
to keep them isolated.
container. Yeah, so
It's like Inception.
Yeah,
We're running Docker inside of Docker inside
you
of
can
Lando,
you
inside
can
of
do
Docker.
that.
Yes.
You can do that. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes now, maybe go through a couple of examples of ways that I've used it, both Drupal related and non-Drupal related, just to hopefully give a quick overview of the kinds of things that you can use it for. So the first project that I wanted to mention is one that I worked with, collaborated with on with HID Global, and I talked a little bit about it during my NetCamp talk as well. And it's D4DD, and that was Docker for Drupal development. It is a set of 5 or 6 or 7 containers that all interact with each other in a way and provide a lot of tools that you would need when making a Drupal site. So, for example, there is a Jenkins container, and there's a SonarQube container for testing. It's got a bunch of things in there, so you can run PHP unit tests very easily. It's got MariaDB and Nginx. It's got a whole network, Solar, although I don't think the Solar is working currently. But it's got a whole bunch of things interconnected, and it's an easy way to spin up.
Nick, is that something that you'd find on Docker Hub or Docker Store, or is it sitting in a repo
No.
somewhere?
Yeah, no, it's on GitHub. So if you look for D4DD, you should be able to find it on GitHub.
Okay.
And it uses, we didn't cover this too much, but there's a companion project to Docker called Docker Compose. And Docker Compose is basically just like Docker files are like a recipe for building a particular image. Docker Compose is kind of like a recipe in order to stitch together a bunch of different containers, and get to the point that I was talking about earlier, where you have, Nginx automatically connected with your code base and automatically connected with MariaDB. And D4DD is a good way to review that and kind of see how that works.
Nick,
Um,
would you recommend this? Would you recommend this as a good starting point for someone to create a local environment for Drupal? Is this your
yeah,
recommendation?
I think it's a good way. I think Docker for Drupal is another project that people are using. I think Doxel is another one. I mean, there's a bunch of competing ones. I use D4DD personally, but that's because I help put it together.
I can see you listed as a contributor.
Yes. So another use case, I've recently been doing a lot of AWS work, and AWS has an AWS CLI program to help you interact with the 500,000 products that Amazon provides for developers. And it was critical for me to use that for one of my clients for some of the projects I was doing for testing and deployment and some other things. And I found every other update to Python was just utterly breaking my install. And so what I did was I set up a Docker file and set it up to install a known version of Python that I knew would work, a known version of AWS CLI that worked with that Python, and set up to pull in the secret key for that particular client and embed it. And whenever I need to use it, I just spin it up, SSH into it, and I can run whatever commands I need to run. Similarly, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a side note, if you are looking for D for DD right now and you found a Hyundai engine, put Drupal in front of that. Drupal D for DD.
That's funny. I'm gonna put Hyundai in the code in the repo so that will show up too. I think the final example is probably more close to home. I have another client that uses their theme uses a fairly old version of Compass, and I didn't have to work on their theme very often, but I found every time I needed to work on it, I would need to change, I'd have to go through this whole process of Googling, how do I uninstall the gem? How do I install a specific version? And I would have to basically install a specific version of SAS and Compass that work together in order to compile. So I finally just set up a Compass container that had those particular settings. And now when I'm using that project, I just spin up that container, and I have it set up to pull in their theme. And this is another advantage. You can do this with Vagrant, but it's a lot harder. One thing that you can do when you're running the container rather than an image, you can set it up so that it's looking at a particular folder or directory, and that changes that happen in Docker also happen in the directory. So things like this. So the Compass one, when I run compile, it compiles the SAS and outputs the CSS, but that same CSS gets overwritten in the directory on my actual computer. So I can just I can run that command and then refresh the website, and the theme will be updated. You can configure it either way.
It's not any harder in Vagrant.
Oh, is it? I remember being confused about that at one point. So maybe it was
works fine. Yeah.
Okay, so scratch that advantage, but it works that way as well in Docker. And I was able to set that up with Compass, and now I just use Compass whenever. And the nice thing is you can set it up to, I mean, you can go as far as you want. You can basically set it up so that it on a project specific basis, like for example, on this project, it uses Compass 1.0. On this project, it uses the older version of Compass that you need, so that you just spin up that particular container. It looks at a config file and uses the version that you need. And so it's pretty nice.
Okay. Any last things we want to say about Docker before we close out?
I mean, I would say again, kind of outside the Drupal sphere, if you're interested in the kinds of things it can do, there's a Docker Con, and a lot of their talks are available, and their keynotes show some of the more impressive things that I've ever seen on the web. So if you take a look at kind of what some of the cutting edge companies are doing with Docker, I think you'll be blown away.
You know, as developers, our best friend over the past 15 years has been Google. And I think even recently, YouTube is a great resource. It's also Google in a way, but it's also
Yeah.
a great resource for learning things. You go in there and type Docker Drupal, you'll probably find a half a dozen or a dozen Drupal camp presentations on Docker. You'll find Nick's for sure, and you'll find other ones, and they'll go through great ways to get this running in Drupal. But I mean, the key point today is this is something as a developer, if you're not using any of these local environments beyond MAMP, it's time for you to start doing that because the world is moving quickly without you.
Yeah. And so it's great for developers, it's great for testing. One thing that we didn't really get into is that it's also good for if you need to give somebody access to the site locally that isn't a developer, like you can set up scripts, you can fairly easily set up scripts that pull down an image. So like if a QA person or a content writer or a designer or whoever, if they're not technical, they're not able to set up a lamp stack or whatever to run the site locally, but they have that need. Docker is a good way to do that. Or actually, a really good example, one of my clients um, set up a way to use Docker to build their theme, and their theme uses Node and a bunch of other stuff, and so it's a really complex process, and they Dockerized it. And so if a designer is working on it, they can change it to CSS, they can run a command, it will pull down the latest Docker image, run everything, and it will build the theme, and then they can do the work. So they basically have a full functioning stack on their machine without needing the expertise to set up Apache or MAMP or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Which, if you're a developer, is something you're used to, but if you're a designer, sometimes is a bit beyond the scope of your job description. So it's a great way to share what you're working on.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's call this a night. What do you say, guys?
Yeah, it's getting late.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Let's say if you are interested in seeing the show notes, any links that we've mentioned or even haven't mentioned on the show, we try to get them all into the show notes, and you'll be able to find those at talkingdrupal.com/158 for this episode. You'll also find this show and show notes on YouTube. And you'll be able to find us on all the podcasting places that you can find podcasts, Apple and all those other places. We're out there. So check us out. You can also email us now at show, SHOW, at talkingdrupal.com. If you have any questions or comments, send them there. And Nick, where can people reach out to you?
You can find me online at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
You can also, submit some issues out on his GitHub for his D4DD.
Yeah, feel free
project.
to request features or point out bugs or improvements.
Or ask him how to change the oil in the engine.
Exactly. John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and go over to umthink.com and check out our blog. We're putting up some pretty interesting stuff every week, and you can read more about what we do and learn some things.
Great. And I'm Stephen Cross. You can find me on Twitter at Stephen Cross. And that's it, guys. Talk to you soon.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Have a good night. Bye.